Glad to have Randy and Scott in our audience today. Randy and I have known each other since we were about 5 years old and graduated from high school together, started school together with Janet. And Donnie, I want you to know that all those times you flashed those lights at me and pulled me over, it was probably Randy's fault. Okay? So I'm glad they're here. You probably don't want me to say this, but do you realize it's 3 weeks from today that Christmas arrives? And yes, it falls on a Sunday, and that might make some of you a bit uneasy. 3 weeks left until that day arrives. But it's reality. And what I want to do today is talk about reality. And you remember that we're in the first chapter of the gospel written by John. And John has been addressing this one question all the way through his first chapter. Who is Jesus? You remember some of the things we've learned thus far? Jesus is God, and Jesus is creator, and Jesus is light, and Jesus is man. And in John chapter 1 in verse 14, we learned that Jesus did come, as we heard in the prayer this morning, full of grace and truth. And we spent time talking about Jesus being the man of grace last week, the loving kindness, even to those who did not deserve it. And now this week, we talk about truth. Just, Jesus is truth. And it seems like John really wants us to know that Jesus is the truth. Now, I know what you're thinking. If Jesus is God, then God is truth, and every word that comes from God is truth. And so this Bible is truth, and it's impossible for God to lie because God is so holy. But John in his gospel wants to focus on one thing. Jesus is truth. John's the one who will record Jesus talking to Thomas. And he says to Thomas in John chapter 14, I am the way, I am the truth. And in just a few weeks, we'll be in John chapter 4, and there'll be a story there, and Jesus is talking with a Samaritan woman, and somehow they'll get on the subject of worship, and they'll use that phrase that we often hear in prayers, in spirit and in truth. And I find myself wondering, when we get to that part, will we learn something or see something maybe differently than we've ever seen it before and thought about it before? Jesus is truth. And I have a couple little tiny things I want to say about truth, and then one big thing I want to say about it. And so the first thing I want you to know is that truth is hard to find. It's just hard to find. Now, we said in previous lessons from John chapter 1 that light is hard to find in a world that's getting darker and darker. And we said last week that loving kindness or grace is getting harder to find in this world. Truth is hard to find. Do you think our government tells us the truth on all things? No. We all know better than that now. Do you think media tells us the truth on all things, whether it's the printed media or it's in newscasts on television or whether it's social media? Do they tell us the truth on everything? And we all know better than that. They don't tell us the truth all the time. When I was growing up, the word was propaganda. Propaganda is misleading information that's designed to mislead people. But when I was growing up, it was always somewhere far away, I thought. It was always in Russia or China or Hitler's Germany and how the people were so starved for the truth and how they would give misleading information all the while. And now here I find we're living in a world where truth is hard to find because we're misled all the time. It shouldn't surprise me Because Jesus will say in this same book, it's the one he'll say, don't you know about Satan? And don't you know that Satan is a liar? And don't you know that Satan is the father of lies? And so all this lying is coming from Satan. And it's even upon us right now. Here's a second little thing I want you to know about truth. Many resist truth. In fact, I kind of think people in general have an aversion to the truth. We don't even want to know it sometimes. You know why we don't want to know it? Because it requires us to change. Do you ever dread going to the doctor? Because you don't want to hear what? The truth? Have you ever taken a personality test? Now, I've taken many at this point. They've been trying to figure me out for a long time. But the very first time in a group setting I took a personality test, I got nervous. I was afraid of what they were going to see and what they were going to say. I didn't want to know the truth. And there are people even in religious settings and in all settings that the truth is right here, but they just don't want to hear it because they've thought this one way so long and it requires change. And by the way, in John's gospel, there'll be many times Jesus will confront people, especially religious people, with the new truth, the truth that lies in him. They won't want to hear it because it requires change. So here it is. Truth's hard to find, and we naturally tend to resist truth. But if you're going to hear it, here's what you have to know. And here's the main thing I want to talk about this morning. It's truth combined with grace that allows us to really hear and make a change in our lives. Truth. Jesus came full of truth and grace. And watch him talk, especially in John's gospel. John's going to try with all his might to make sure we understand how Jesus will approach people, and they'll be committing horrible sins, and they'll be in such a mess in their life, and he'll approach them with such kindness, loving kindness, but he'll tell them the truth. And I can tell you something about your family. It's only truth combined with grace that allows truth to be heard in a marriage, with your children, or where you work. It's only truth combined with grace. See, I've had people try to tell me the truth before, and they've yelled, or they've slammed their fist on my desk. It never worked very well. First of all, I couldn't hear them. And secondly, I have a tendency to react. And when you react, the escalation goes up. But occasionally I've had people tell me the truth, and they've done it out of a gracious spirit. And I could hear it. And some of you have heard me tell the story about Larry. And it occurred when I was still president of Lubbock Christian. And it was at a time in that tenure when I was ready to be done. And I was tired. I was worn out. I was filled with anxiety. And one Sunday morning, Susan and I got up to get ready to go to church, and I said, would you mind if we don't go where we normally go? I don't want to be around all those people. I don't want to have to talk to people. I said, do you mind if we drive out 10 miles away from Lubbock, farther from our house, but 10 miles from the city limits, to a little tiny farming community where they have a little tiny church they're trying to rebuild? Had 40 people maybe. And so we went. I knew Larry and Helen would be the only people we would see that would talk. And so we sat toward the back. And after it was over, Larry and Helen came and we talked. And I happened to mention to Larry that we needed to buy a black bull out here in western Oklahoma. And Larry said, Ken, I know where some black bulls are. He said, my brother just bought one, and I just bought one, and they're out here by Wolforth. which was on the other side of Lubbock. And he said, the man who owns them goes to church over at Broadway. And I said, give me his name. I'll call him. I visited with that man, by the way, a few weeks ago. The man who owns the Bulls. And he said, no. I'm not going to give you his name. He said, I'll pick you up today, this afternoon, and we'll go see them. And I thought, oh, man, I don't want to do that. But Larry came, and we got in his pickup, and we went out and looked at the bulls, and I found some bulls I really liked. And we came back and pulled up on this circle driveway and in the old president's house, and Larry killed his pickup. And I thought, this is not good. Larry's going to want to talk for a long time. But he didn't talk very long. He said, Ken, I've got to tell you something. He said, you know I have two brothers, but in some ways you are closer to me than either one of my brothers. In fact, when we're together a lot, people think you and I are brothers. But he said, I've got something I got to tell you. He said, something's wrong with you. He said, you don't smile anymore. He said, something is wrong, and I think it's your job. I think your job's killing you. And I said, Larry, you're the third person in 3 weeks who have told me the same thing. And I know you're right, and I'm trying to figure out what to do. Larry told me some truth, but what was his spirit in telling me that truth? Do you see the loving kindness? Do you see the graciousness? Do you see how Larry is saying, I have two brothers, and in some ways you're closer to me than either one of my brothers? How can I not listen? How can I not respond? It's truth plus grace that Jesus shows us in this world. Remember, what was it, 2 years ago, we were spending all that time in the life of David. 18 months in the life of David, something like that. One of the stories in the life of David is a truth and grace story. Now, I loved a lot of the stories in the life of David, but this one I like particularly well. Because David is living out in the wilderness in 1 Samuel chapter 25. That means he's not living in Israel. He's not living in his homeland. He's not living near his mother and father and brothers. And he has 600 fighting men that have joined him and their families. And they live in the desert. And can you imagine the difficulty of living in a desert with 600 fighting men and their families? The difficulty of finding every day adequate food supplies? And so in 1 Samuel chapter 25, it begins by talking about a man named Nabal, who's a very wealthy farmer. And Nabal is having his sheep shearing time. It's what you and I would call harvest time. It's the time of the year when you strip all your cotton or pick all your cotton, whatever they do today, Ben. I don't know what you do with cotton today, but it's when you're going to sell all your cotton and you're going to have all this wealth come in afresh. And Nabal's shearing all of his sheep. But what you need to know about Nabal is he's a big, mean, harsh, hard, uncaring, and selfish person. That's Nabal. But David doesn't know that. And David sends 10 of his soldiers, 10 of his young soldiers to Nabal. He knows it's his festive time. And the 10 soldiers say, David is our master. He's been out here in the wilderness all the time your sheep herders have been out in the wilderness. And he's watched over them. He's not taken a single lamb. In fact, he's kind of protected your people without you even knowing it. And the request is for food. Can we have some food? But remember, Nabal is mean. And he's selfish. And he looks at those 10 soldiers and said, who is this David? Who is this son of Jesse? He's probably some runaway slave. In fact, he was a runaway. I'll give him nothing. And it was said in such an ugly tone, it must have been insulting. And so those 10 soldiers return to David and they tell David the story. Now, what do you remember about David? Well, David is, he's the Old Testament Peter equivalent. David can get flash mad. Anybody here ever gotten flash mad? Just comes on you all of a sudden and you can't help yourself? David hears a story. And David says, as he's putting on his own sword to 400 of his men, strap on your swords. And he takes a vow. His vow is this: may God deal with me, and may it be ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow Nabal doesn't have all of his people, male people, dead. I'm killing them all. Nabal, if he's got any sons, all of his male servants, they're dead. Now let me tell you, David's very capable. If you read those stories, you think about those stories, David and his 600 men have defeated massive armies. And 400 men will do it. And David's on his way. Now, again, does that sound very familiar to you? Does that sound familiar at all? How many times have you been spoken to harshly or meanly or whatever, and it's maybe you don't strap on a sword, but you're ready to go, and it escalates. I can almost feel myself in David's shoes or sandals or whatever they were. And he's going. But as he's making his trip to Nabal, Nabal's wife hears the story. Now, Nabal's wife is named Abigail. And she must be extremely beautiful inside and out. How she got married to Nabal, I don't know, except it must have been an arranged marriage. Because she's everything that Nabal is not. And she hears a story, and she tells some servants, load up the donkeys with all this food. And she goes out with all this food on these donkeys, and she meets David kind of halfway. And she falls down on the ground before David and calls David, my Lord. And she says, I know what my husband's like. I know how mean he is. But she says, David, you're going to become the next king. You're going to be the king. We all know that God selected you to be king. And if you come to be king, do you think it's right for you to have all this innocent blood on your hands? It's Nabal's fault. It's not all these other people. Do you think it's right for you to go to the throne having this innocent blood shed by your own hands? Anybody remember what David does? He stops in his tracks. And he says to Abigail, praise be to God that he has sent you to me so that I might not have this guilt of shedding innocent blood. And he turns around and goes back home. The truth was, David, if you come to the throne and you have this innocent blood, do you think it's going to work well? You shouldn't be doing this, David. That's the truth. But how was it presented? With such kindness and respect. And David could then hear it. If she had come out and said it any other way, David would not have heard it. He would have continued right on his journey. That's why in our families, it's truth. Because if you don't know the truth today, you can't make good decisions for tomorrow. It's truth that's so very, very important. Though it's so rare in our world, it's so important. But it's truth in your family presented with grace. And I'm going to tell you, it's the same thing in a church building like this. So do you remember how I told you last week the story? The week before, that'd be 2 weeks now, I walked out of here, and I don't carry my phone with me. It's in the vehicle, and I pick up my phone. It's immediately walking out of the building. And I read on my phone these series of texts from one person in another faraway place, not in Oklahoma, saying, here's what one of the people did in our church today, one of our leaders. Here's what they've said. And it was harsh, and it was hard. By the way, it could have been the truth. I'm not sure about that. It could have been the truth. But if it was, it wasn't heard. May we never stand in a building like this and talk about Jesus in a harsh, hard, mean tone. And if you got me on that subject, I would tell you about how many people I have seen in the name of religion be so hard and so mean. I saw one leave Sue's in tears at the back of an auditorium. And I could tell you how that kind of worked out. Okay? There's no call for it. Because the King of our kingdom is a man named Jesus. And he came full of grace and truth. How do we dare have any right to act in a different way except grace and truth? Let me add one more thing. Our world is really messed up. You know that. And people get their lives messed up all the time. We've had people come here in the last few weeks whose lives are all messed up. And maybe some are messed up I don't know about. But they are the ones who in particular need to hear loving kindness, truth mingled with it. But they got to hear it that way. They don't need to hear us beating them up. They've already been beaten up. They're beating themselves up. So who is Jesus? Yes, he's God. He's creator. He's the light in a dark world. He became a man so that we could be set free and could become children of God. And he came full of grace and truth so that we might hear him and might respond to him. So let's stop there and let's remember Jesus. Let's remember Jesus by taking our Lord's Supper together and remember that he came. Why did he come? To save people like us. What did it require? Him dying that horrible death that we often discuss.